She didn't know that rainy night would change everything. A black business card, a dangerous man, and a choice from which there was no turning back. Evelyn Hart survived 8 months of hell, but no one prepared her for this. The only one willing to protect her was the most terrifying man in Chicago. This is the story of the thin line between salvation and destruction, and of a woman who dared to cross it. Like, comment the city you're viewing in so I know how far this story has come. And don't go anywhere, because it's only just beginning. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and old regret. Evelyn Hart had worked the closing shift at Manny's for the better part of 2 years, and by now she knew every crack in the laminate countertop, every flicker of the third fluorescent tube above the register, every way the front door groaned differently, depending on how hard the wind pushed against it. She knew this place the way you know a prison cell after the bars stop feeling like bars. Not because you've accepted it, but because your body has simply run out of the energy required to keep hating it. Outside, rain came down in sheets. Not the romantic kind that blurs city lights into soft watercolors. This was Chicago rain in late October. Aggressive, sideways, cold enough to reach inside your coat and wrap its fingers around your spine. The neon sign above the window buzzed and flickered, throwing violet and red light across the wet pavement in a way that made the street look like a wound. Evelyn wiped down this counter for the 4th time in 20 minutes. Not because it was dirty, because she needed something to do with her hands. Because standing still made her feel like a target. The bruise beneath her left eye had deepened overnight. She'd layered concealer over it twice before her shift. The cheap drugstore kind. $3 a tube. The kind that settles into fine lines and cracks under fluorescent light like old paint on a wall that's seen too much weather. She knew it wasn't working. She'd caught Darlene, the day shift cook, staring at her cheekbone twice already without saying a word. That silence was its own kind of language. Everybody who worked at Manny's had learned to speak it fluently. Don't ask, don't offer, don't get involved. It was easier that way. Evelyn understood that. She even respected it, in a dark, pragmatic corner of herself that had stopped expecting anything better from people a long time ago. She moved to the far end of the counter and started refilling the sugar dispensers, even though most of them were still half full. The motion was automatic, purposeless, something to anchor her hands while her mind did its usual work, running the numbers, checking the math, calculating how close she was. 8 months. 8 months of double shifts and skipped meals and wearing the same 3 pairs of shoes in rotation until the soles developed opinions about wet weather. 8 months of folding every tip into a rubber-banded roll she kept behind a loose tile under her bathroom sink, a hiding spot Travis had never found, because Travis, for all his violence, was not a curious man. He didn't look for things unless he already suspected they existed. She had $4,212. She needed at least $6,000 to get out. First and last month's rent somewhere outside Illinois, a used car that wouldn't die on the highway, a security deposit, 2 weeks of groceries while she figured out the rest. The math had been the same for 3 months. The gap between what she had and what she needed kept closing, but slowly, in a way that felt like watching a clock move from across the room. You knew time was passing. You just couldn't feel it. The bell above the door knocked against its frame. Evelyn didn't look up immediately. Late customers on a Tuesday night in the rain were usually the same rotation: cab drivers, second-shift factory workers, the occasional insomniac nursing decaf and existential exhaustion. She reached for a menu without thinking and turned toward the door with the automatic half-smile she'd perfected over years, the one that said, "I'll be with you in a moment," without requiring any actual emotional investment. Then she looked up, and the smile stopped working. The man who walked through the door was not a cab driver. He was tall, not in the lanky, accidental way of men who simply kept growing past a reasonable height, but in the deliberate, structural way of someone whose body had been built around presence. Dark hair, cut close on the sides, slightly longer on top with the kind of disarray that wasn't accidental. A charcoal suit that probably cost more than Evelyn's monthly rent. The kind of suit that didn't move wrong, didn't wrinkle in the wrong places, sat on the shoulders like it had been poured there. He wore no tie. The top button of his shirt was open. That single detail felt strangely more threatening than if he'd been fully armored. He walked to the corner booth by the window without waiting to be seated. No hesitation. No glance at the menu stand. He moved through the diner the way men who own rooms move through them, like the furniture had already been arranged to accommodate him, and he simply hadn't bothered to notice it. The two other customers in the diner, a middle-aged trucker in a John Deere cap and a teenage girl doing homework over a plate of untouched fries, both went quiet in the same moment without visible reason. The kind of quiet that happens below conscious thought, when the part of the brain responsible for survival quietly clears its throat. Evelyn stood still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she picked up the coffee pot and walked to the corner booth. Up close he was worse, not in an ugly way. In the way a storm is worse up close, more real, more consuming, filling more of the frame than you'd calculated from a distance. His eyes were very dark, almost black in the fluorescent light, and they moved to her face the moment she reached the table with the particular focus of someone who had spent years watching things closely because watching closely had saved his life on more than one occasion. She felt his gaze find the bruise. No social grace about it, no polite redirection. He looked at it directly, the way a surgeon looks at a wound, clinically and without flinching. "Coffee?" Evelyn asked. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Black," he said. She poured. Her hand was not entirely stable, and she was aware of that, and she was aware that he was aware of it, and none of that made anything easier. "You want a menu?" No. She should have walked away. That was the logical thing. He'd ordered coffee, simple transaction, no reason to linger. But he spoke before she could move. "Who did that to you?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Not loud, not aggressive, but impossibly direct, without preamble or cushion. His voice was low, even, carrying the specific gravity of a man who asked questions he already knew the partial answer to. Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Excuse me? Your face." He didn't gesture at it, didn't need to. "Who did that?" It wasn't phrased as a question the second time. That distinction wasn't lost on her. "I walked into a cabinet." The lie was reflexive, years old, worn smooth from repetition. "Clumsy. You want anything else?" He looked at her for a moment, not in the way that made her skin crawl. She knew that look, had been navigating it since she was 17. This was something different, quiet, assessing, like he was filing something away. "No," he said. She walked back to the counter. Her pulse was doing something complicated. For the next 40 minutes, he sat in that corner booth and drank 2 cups of coffee and stared out the rain-blurred window without touching his phone, without speaking to anyone, without doing anything that constituted a normal human activity in a public space. Men like that didn't sit in diners like this. Men like that had drivers and private clubs and kitchens staffed by people with culinary degrees. There was no version of reality in which this man belonged in Manny's on a Tuesday night in a rainstorm. Evelyn kept her eyes on the counter and tried not to think about it too hard. At 11:47, he stood. He left 2 folded bills on the table. She checked later and found 200s, which was roughly $19 more than the bill, plus any sane interpretation of a tip. But it was the other thing that stopped her cold. A business card. Black, thick stock, the kind of paper that has weight to it, that feels like a deliberate choice. On it, embossed in silver, was a phone number. Nothing else. No name, no company, no title, just 10 digits that felt like a dare. She stood there holding it long enough for Darlene to stick her head through the kitchen window. "Everything okay out there?" "Fine," Evelyn said. She put the card in her apron pocket. Her hands had stopped shaking for the first time all shift. The rain had eased to a cold drizzle by the time her shift ended at midnight. She changed out of her uniform in the small bathroom at the back of the diner, jeans, a gray hoodie, her least worn pair of sneakers, and pushed out the back door into the alley that ran behind the strip of businesses on this block. She'd been taking the back exit for 3 months, ever since Travis had started showing up at the front entrance on nights he felt like reminding her that he still knew where she worked. She made it about 40 feet down the alley before she heard him. "Where you been?" Travis Cole stepped out from the gap between 2 dumpsters with the specific casualness of someone who'd been waiting there long enough to work up a story about how casual they were about it. He was wearing his work jacket, the dark blue one with the garage logo on the chest, and he smelled like beer and motor oil and the specific bitterness of a man who'd been talking himself into something for the last 2 hours. Evelyn stopped walking. Something locked in her chest, a combination of fear and exhaustion that had become so familiar it barely registered as fear anymore. It was closer to weather, something you simply existed inside of. Just finished my shift, she said. You're 20 minutes late. I had closeout tasks. You're 20 minutes late. He took a step toward her. In the weak yellow light from the single working lamp at the end of the alley, his face had the particular blankness that she'd learned to read the way meteorologists read pressure systems. That blankness meant the decision had already been made somewhere below the surface, that whatever conversation happened next was theater, that the ending had already been written. Travis? Her voice was quiet, controlled. She'd learned that tone over many months. Not pleading, not challenging, just flat enough to give him nothing to push against. I'm tired. Let's just go home. Show me your pockets. She went very still. What? Your pockets. His voice had gone to that place. That register. The one that lived at the bottom of his range when he'd made up his mind. Turn them out. She thought about this card. She thought about the phone number embossed in silver. She thought about the man in the corner booth who had looked at her bruise like it was a war crime and asked his question without any cruelty in it, just a cold, clean fury aimed somewhere past her. There's nothing in my pockets, she said. He was across the distance between them faster than she'd tracked. That was always the part that surprised her, no matter how many times she'd been through this. The speed. You never clocked it correctly from a distance. One moment he was 3 feet away, and then his hand was in her apron pocket, which she'd forgotten she was still wearing, and his fingers closed around the black card before she could process what was happening. He held it up, stared at it. The silence in the alley had a texture to it. What is this? It's nothing. A customer left it. The slap came from the left, open-handed, landing across her cheekbone just below the existing bruise. The impact turned her head and sent a bright white spike of pain through her sinuses. She grabbed the dumpster to keep from going down, her palm slipping on the wet metal, catching herself on her forearm instead. She tasted blood. Her lip had caught her tooth. Travis was talking. She could hear his voice, the words coming out in that compressed, rapid-fire way that meant he'd escalated past the point where he was choosing them carefully. But the sound was underwater for a moment, the alley tilting slightly as she worked to get her breath back. Then light flooded the end of the alley. Headlights, a black sedan, long and low, moving at a crawl along the street at the alley's mouth, and then stopping. The engine idled, the light held steady. The back door opened. No one got out. The door simply opened, and the interior light revealed a man sitting in the back seat with the door now wide to the rain, his dark eyes fixed on the alley with the absolute stillness of someone who had already decided what happened next and was simply waiting for the variable in the middle to catch up. Lucian DeMarco said nothing. He didn't have to. Travis had gone rigid. She could feel it without looking at him directly. The shift in his body, the recalculation, the sudden animal awareness that something in the equation had changed in a way he didn't have vocabulary for yet. Evelyn straightened. She pressed the back of her hand against her split lip. The blood was warm against her cold fingers. She looked at the open door. She looked at the man sitting inside it. She thought about $4,212 behind a loose tile. She thought about the slow clock. She thought about the math that hadn't moved in 3 months. Get in, Evelyn, Lucien said, quietly, like he was asking her if she wanted more coffee. Travis made a sound, something between a laugh and a threat, words assembling themselves into a territorial display. Evelyn didn't hear them. She was already walking. She didn't run. Running would have felt like fear, and she had made a private decision, somewhere between the dumpster and the headlights, that she was done performing fear for people who had mistaken it for permission. She walked down that alley with her split lip and a ruined concealer and her apron still tied around her waist, and she walked straight to that open door and she got inside. The door closed behind her. The sedan pulled away from the curb with the unhurried authority of a machine that did not acknowledge traffic or urgency. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Evelyn stared at her own hands in her lap. Her knuckles were scraped from the dumpster. A small thread of blood had worked its way down her chin. She was aware of all of this in a distant, cataloging way, the way you become hyper-aware of your own body when you've spent too long being afraid of what it can and cannot survive. You're bleeding, Lucien said. I'm aware. There was a pause. Are you hurt anywhere else? I'm fine. Another pause, longer this time. She could feel him looking at her without turning her head to confirm it. You said that before, he said, about the cabinet. Evelyn closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them and looked out the window at the rain-slicked streets of Chicago moving past in the dark, the light smearing across the wet glass in long horizontal lines. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Somewhere safe." "That's not an address." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She should have told him to stop the car. Every reasonable instinct she possessed, the ones shaped by 2 years of keeping her head down and her expectations low and her emergency fund behind a loose tile, was pulling in that direction. She didn't know this man. She knew only what she could read from him: money, authority, danger, and something beneath all of that she couldn't name yet. Something that lived in the way he'd looked at her bruise, not with pity, but with rage. Quiet and controlled and pointed like a blade that hadn't been unsheathed yet. She didn't tell him to stop the car. She reached up instead and untied the apron from around her waist and folded it in her lap with the careful precision of someone who needed their hands to be doing something while their mind worked through what they'd just done. She had just gotten into a stranger's car in the middle of the night to escape one dangerous man by putting herself in the company of another. She understood this. She wasn't naive about it. She just also understood that the alternative was the alley. And she had been in enough versions of the alley to know that it only ended one way if she kept choosing it. The car took the expressway north. The city opened up around them, the skyline rising to the east in its familiar geometry, all steel and lit windows against the black sky. From up here on the elevated road, Chicago looked like something that didn't have alleys in it, something clean and structured and organized around logic rather than survival. Evelyn pressed her fingers against her split lip and watched the skyline and said nothing. Beside her, Lucien DeMarco also said nothing. He sat with one arm resting along the window frame, his posture utterly composed, looking forward at the road with an expression that a person standing on the street watching the car pass would not have been able to read. He wore calm the way he wore his suit, like it had been tailored specifically for him, like it had never been off. But she caught it for a half second before he adjusted. When he thought she wasn't watching, she saw him look at her mouth where the blood had dried. And in the fraction of that moment, his jaw had tightened in a way that had nothing to do with calm. She filed that away. She didn't know what to do with it yet, but she filed it away with the particular discipline of a woman who had learned that the details you notice in other people are often the only map you have to work with. The sedan exited the expressway. The streets changed, wider, quieter, lined with iron gates and security cameras and buildings that didn't have business signs, because the people who needed to know what happened inside them already knew. The car stopped in front of a building that was not a building so much as a statement. Glass and steel and precise lighting. A lobby visible through floor-to-ceiling windows where 2 men in dark clothing stood at an angle that wasn't quite standing still. An elevator bank visible beyond the lobby. Everything immaculate. Everything quiet. The driver, a man in his 50s whom Evelyn had not seen get in the car and had not acknowledged her existence since she'd gotten in, stepped out and opened her door. Evelyn didn't move for a moment. "You don't have to come inside," Lucien said. He was looking forward, not at her. "I can have him drive you anywhere you want to go." She looked at the building. She looked at her hands. "You said safe," she said. "I did." "How safe?" "Safer than where you were standing 40 minutes ago." A beat. "For tonight, at minimum." She looked out through the lobby windows. One of the men by the elevator caught the motion and looked in the direction of the car. His expression was professional, attentive, the expression of a person who was very good at his job and had been told specifically what his job was tonight. Evelyn Hart, who had been surviving on $4,212 and 3 pairs of shoes and a hiding spot behind a loose tile, got out of the car. She stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the building for exactly 3 seconds, rain misting against her face. Then she walked through the front door. She didn't know, standing there in the lobby with wet sneakers and a dried blood on her chin and a folded apron under her arm, that she had just made the most dangerous decision of her life. She also didn't know, and would not understand for several weeks yet, that it would also turn out to be the first decision in 8 months that she had made entirely for herself. The elevator doors closed. The building rose. Chicago shrank below them into a grid of lights in the rain. And somewhere in the alley behind Manny's diner, A black business card with a silver phone number lay face down in a puddle, already dissolving, already gone, as if the universe were quietly erasing the moment before it, so that only the moment ahead remained. Evelyn thought the hardest part was already behind her. She was wrong. Because upstairs, 32 floors above the city, Lucien DeMarco was about to tell her the truth about who he was. And the truth was going to ask her a question she wasn't sure she had the courage to answer. The elevator had no mirrors. Evelyn noticed that first. Most elevators had at least one, a practical concession to the human need to check yourself before arriving somewhere, to make sure you looked like a person who belonged wherever you were going. This elevator had none. Just brushed steel walls, recessed lighting set to a warm amber that softened everything, and a panel with only 2 buttons, lobby and a floor number that she'd watched Lucien press without hesitation. 32. She stood on the opposite side of the elevator from him. 3 feet of loaded silence between them. She could see herself faintly in the steel wall opposite, a warped, amber-washed ghost of a reflection. Messy hair, dark smudge below her left eye, where the concealer had given up entirely, dried rust-colored fleck at the corner of her mouth. Apron still folded over her arm like she was between tables. She looked like exactly what she was. A waitress from a diner on the edge of downtown who had made a decision 40 minutes ago that she was still in the process of understanding. Lucien stood with his hands loosely at his sides, looking straight at the elevator doors. He had not spoken since the lobby. He was very still in the way that water is still before something large moves beneath it, not peaceful, just quiet on the surface, with everything that mattered happening somewhere you couldn't see. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. Evelyn had a general concept of what wealthy looked like. She'd grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Pilsen where the radiator worked on its own schedule, and her mother kept a coffee can in the kitchen cabinet for emergencies. She'd cleaned houses for extra money in high school, big houses in Lincoln Park and Evanston, places with sub-zero refrigerators and heated bathroom floors, and mudrooms larger than her childhood bedroom. She understood wealthy the way you understand a foreign country you've read about extensively but never visited. This was not that. The penthouse occupied the entire 32nd floor, floor-to-ceiling glass walls on 3 sides. Chicago laid out below like a circuit board someone had left the lights on in, all grid and density and amber and white, stretching to a horizon that dissolved into low cloud. Rain moved against the glass in slow, irregular patterns, like the city was breathing against it. The interior was sparse in the way that things are when sparseness is a choice rather than a limitation. A few large pieces of furniture arranged with the confidence of someone who didn't need to fill space to feel comfortable in it. Dark leather, raw concrete, a bar cart with bottles that caught the ambient light. Somewhere deeper in the apartment, a low hum of climate control, the building maintaining itself. 2 men stood near the far wall, not like furniture, not like decoration. They stood with the specific uprightness of men who were always aware of where the exits were and who was nearest to them. One of them glanced at Lucien as they walked in. Lucien made a motion with 2 fingers, small, economical, and both men moved toward a hallway and disappeared. Evelyn stood on the threshold between the elevator and the main room. She hadn't moved past it yet. "You can come inside," Lucien said, without turning around. He'd moved to the bar cart and was pouring something amber into a low glass. "The floor isn't electrified." "That's reassuring." "I thought it might be." He set the bottle down, held up the glass without looking at her. "Drink?" "No." He poured a second glass anyway and set it on the coffee table nearest to her. A peace offering, maybe. Or a habit. Either way, he didn't push it. Evelyn stepped inside. The floor was dark wood, cool even through her sneakers. The ceiling was high enough that sound moved differently up here, less absorbed, more space for it to travel before it settled. She was aware of her own breathing in a way she hadn't been in the elevator. "Sit down," Lucien said. He was still at the bar. His back was to her. "I'd rather stand." A pause. "All right." She looked around the room, not admiring it, mapping it. Old habit. She'd been mapping rooms for exit points since she was 19 years old, a skill she'd developed the way you develop most survival skills, out of necessity and repetition rather than any conscious decision to become someone who thought this way. There was the elevator behind her, a hallway to the left where the 2 men had gone, Two other doors further in, one closed, one slightly ajar, showing the edge of what looked like a bedroom. A staircase she couldn't see yet, but could infer from the building's layout. Lucian turned around and looked at her. "You're mapping the room," he said. It wasn't a question. She met his eyes without flinching. And something shifted in his expression. Not softness, exactly. More like recognition. The specific recognition of a person who has learned to do the same thing and is now observing it in someone else. "Smart," he said. "What do you want from me?" Evelyn asked. Direct. No cushion. She was too tired for cushion. Lucien crossed the room and sat in the chair across from the couch, leaving the couch for her if she chose it. He held his glass with his forearm resting on his knee, and he looked at her with that same clinical directness he'd used in the diner, the look that went straight to the thing rather than circling it. "Nothing," he said. "That's not an answer." "It is, actually." He turned the glass slowly. "I don't want anything from you, Evelyn." "You know my name. It's on the name tag you're still wearing." She looked down. The small plastic tag was still clipped to her shirt collar. Evelyn. She'd worn it so many years that she stopped noticing it was there. She unpinned it and put it in her pocket. The small act of removing it felt disproportionately significant, though she couldn't have explained why. "Your lip needs cleaning," Lucian said. He stood before she could respond, moved to a door off the main room, a bathroom, apparently, and returned a moment later with a first aid kit and a small white cloth. He set both on the coffee table beside the untouched glass of whiskey and sat back down. He didn't offer to do it for her. He just put the materials in reach and looked away toward the window, giving her the option without the performance of it. Evelyn sat on the edge of the couch. She opened the kit, found the antiseptic wipes, the small butterfly closures. Her hands worked mechanically, muscle memory from years of tending her own damage in gas station bathrooms and break room mirrors because the alternative was explaining it to someone. The wipe stung against the split. She didn't make a sound. "His name is Travis Cole," Lucian said, quietly, to the window. Evelyn's hand stopped moving for one beat, then continued. "How do you know that?" "I asked the diner owner who you were after the second time you came to my table." "You've been to Manny's before." "3 times in the last 2 weeks." Another pause. He turned the glass. "I was in the neighborhood. For work." "What kind of work?" He looked at her then. Level, unambiguous, the look of a man who is deciding how much of the truth to release at once. "The kind that requires that neighborhood," he said. "We can talk about the rest when you're not bleeding." Evelyn pressed the cloth to her mouth. The bleeding had slowed to nearly nothing. The split was small, the kind that looks worse than it is and hurts more than it looks. She held the cloth there for a moment, and she looked at this man in his charcoal suit sitting in his penthouse 32 floors above a city he apparently moved through like something that belonged to him, and she made a calculation. "Tell me now," she said. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. 10. "I run this city's criminal infrastructure," Lucien and said. Flat, no softening, no euphemism. Ports, import operations, money, territory. Whatever polite name people put on it in the newspapers, that's what it is. The DeMarco family has controlled most of Chicago's organized operations for 20 years. I've run them for the last 6. He paused. "That's who I am." Evelyn took the cloth away from her lip. She looked at it, put it down on the kit. "And you're telling me this because you'll find out regardless, and I'd rather you hear it from me so you can make your own decision about what you do next." "What decision?" "Whether you stay the night in a room down the hall where no one will touch you and no one will ask you for anything, or whether you get back in the elevator and I have a car take you wherever you want to go." He looked at her steadily. "Those are the options." Evelyn stared at the glass of whiskey she hadn't touched. "You're serious?" "I'm always serious. A crime boss is offering me a guest room out of the goodness of his heart." "I didn't say anything about goodness." His jaw shifted. "My sister's name was Camille. She was 24 years old. She was involved with a man who hurt her for 2 years before it went further than hurting." He looked at the window. His voice did not change registers, still level, still controlled, but there was something behind it now that was load-bearing, something that had been held up for a long time by sheer structural discipline. By the time anyone found out what was happening, there was nothing left to do except identify her. The room was very quiet. Rain pressed against the glass in long, slow movements. Evelyn did not say she was sorry. She'd learned that sorry was a conversation ender, a lid you put on things. And this did not feel like something that wanted a lid put on it. "How long ago?" she asked. 7 years? She nodded, once. She picked up the whiskey glass and held it in both hands without drinking it, just for the warmth. "I'm not her," she said. "I don't need saving." "I know." "Then why?" "Because you're doing it the slow way," he said. And there was something almost sharp in it, not unkind, just direct. The counting and the saving and the waiting. I've watched people do it. Some of them make it out. Some of them don't make it to the finish line before he stopped, set down his glass. "You've been standing at a bus stop in a burning building, Evelyn. That's all I saw." She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. "I'm going to sleep," she said finally. "And in the morning, I'm going to need to figure out what I'm doing." "Fine. And I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not a complication you inherit. I'm not a project, and I don't owe you anything." Correct on all three. He stood, picked up both empty and unemptied glasses, and moved them to the bar cart. "The room at the end of the hall. There are clothes in the closet, various sizes, guest supplies in the bathroom. My men know you're here and know the parameters of that." He said it without elaboration, as if the parameters were so self-evident that naming them would be insulting to both of them. She stood, still holding the first aid kit, which she'd forgotten was in her hand. "Lucien," she said. He stopped at the bar cart and looked at her. "What happened to the man?" she said. "The one who hurt your sister." The pause was very brief. "He had an accident," Lucien said. "About 6 years ago." Evelyn held his gaze for another moment. Then she walked down the hall to the room at the end of it and closed the door behind her. She did not lock it. She wasn't sure yet whether that was trust or exhaustion. She suspected it might be both. The room was spare, clean, smelling of fresh linen and climate control. She sat on the edge of the bed in her jeans and hoodie and looked at the wall opposite for several minutes, going through the math one more time. The only ritual she had left that felt like control. $4,212. The loose tile. The 3 pairs of shoes. She lay down without changing. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She did not dream about Travis. She did not dream about Lucien or the diner or the alley. She dreamed, for the first time in months, about nothing at all. Just a flat, black, merciful absence of everything. And when she woke, the clock on the nightstand said 7:43, and the city outside the window was gray and still wet from the night before, and someone had put a mug of coffee on the small table near the door. Black. She stared at it for a moment. Then she sat up and reached for it with both hands. The next 5 days moved in a strange, suspended rhythm that Evelyn did not have a name for. She was not a prisoner. The elevator worked from the inside. No one followed her from room to room. A car was made available to her any time she asked, with a driver who took her wherever she said without commentary and waited without complaint. But she didn't leave. She told herself it was practical. Travis knew her apartment. That door was closed for now. She needed a few days to arrange things, to figure out the next move, to let the split lip heal so she could walk back into the world without wearing the map of the last 48 hours on her face. All practical, all logical. On the 3rd day, Lucien had someone convert the second guest room into what could only be described as a functional art studio. Not a grand gesture, no ceremony, no announcement. She simply walked past the door one afternoon and it was open, and inside there was a table, good lighting, a set of supplies that someone had put together with obvious research, quality rather than ostentatious, the kind of materials a working artist would choose rather than someone trying to impress an artist. She stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she went inside and sat down at the table and picked up a pencil and started drawing for the first time in 3 years. She didn't think about what that meant. She filed it somewhere she wasn't ready to open yet and kept drawing. Lucien was absent for long stretches, gone before she woke most mornings, returning in the evening or late at night, always clean but sometimes carrying something in his posture that was harder to wash off than grime. She recognized it, the residue of things that had happened that he was still processing while appearing not to process them. She knew that residue. She'd worn it herself. They ate dinner together twice in those 5 days. Simple food, nothing performed. The housekeeper leaving things in the kitchen that they assembled themselves and ate at the large island counter rather than the formal dining table, which felt to Evelyn like a small, unspoken agreement about what kind of arrangement this was and wasn't. The conversations were angular, not comfortable, not yet, not in the way that comfort requires both people to have stopped measuring distance, but honest in a way Evelyn wasn't used to. Lucian said what he meant and didn't say things he didn't mean, which was a more unusual quality than she'd have thought, and she found herself recalibrating to it slowly, like eyes adjusting to a different light level. On the 5th night, he came home at 2 in the morning. She was awake. Old habit, light sleeper. Every creak of a building that size was catalogued the moment she first started staying in it. She heard the elevator, heard his footsteps across the main room. She opened her bedroom door. He was standing at the bar cart. He hadn't poured anything. He was just standing with both hands on the edge of it, his back to her, still in his suit jacket. There was something different in the set of his shoulders. Not injured, not exactly, but worked. The way a bridge looks after a storm has moved through it. "You don't have to stay up," he said. He hadn't turned around. "I wasn't on your account." "I know." She leaned her shoulder against the doorframe, looked at the back of him. "Are you all right?" A very long pause. "Yes," he said, and she believed about 60% of it, which for a man like this she suspected was close to the full percentage he was capable of giving anyone. She pushed off the doorframe, walked to the kitchen, and put the kettle on. She heard, rather than saw, him turn around, the shift in the room's ambient sound, the slight change in air movement. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." She made 2 mugs of tea, which she put on the counter, and she sat on the kitchen stool and wrapped her hands around hers, and she waited in a way that communicated she was not going anywhere, but was also not demanding anything. After a moment, he crossed the room and sat on the stool on the opposite side of the counter, and he picked up the mug, and they both drank in silence for several minutes. "Something went wrong tonight," she said. Not a question. "Something always goes wrong," he said. "The variable is whether the going wrong stays contained." A pause. "Tonight, it stayed contained." "But someone got hurt." He looked at her. "Yes." She nodded. She didn't ask who. It wasn't hers to ask, not yet, possibly not ever. "Does it?" she started. "Yes," he said. Before she'd finished, he set the mug down. "If you're asking whether it still registers, yes." She looked at him across the counter. The kitchen light was low and warm, and the city outside the window behind him was doing its usual nighttime geometry. He looked tired. Not physically. Physically, he was as composed as ever, that suit still doing its job. But behind the eyes, in the quality of his stillness, she could see the accumulated weight of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, with no particular expectation that he'd ever be able to set it down. She thought about the sister. She thought about 7 years. She thought about what it cost to convert grief into armor and then wear that armor every day without letting anyone see the seams. "You should sleep," she said. "Probably." He didn't move. "Lucien." He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. Quietly. For the studio. Something in his face shifted, fractionally. The smallest possible acknowledgement that he'd heard her, that it landed, that it was received by some part of him that he didn't usually leave accessible. "You drew today," he said, "for 3 hours. Good." She slid off the stool and picked up her mug. "Good night." "Good night, Evelyn." She was halfway down the hall when his voice came again, low and even. "Don't leave tomorrow without telling me first." She paused, didn't turn around. "Why?" "Because Travis Cole has been outside this building twice in the last 4 days." The mug was warm in her hands. The hallway was quiet. Outside, far below, Chicago moved through its nighttime self in all its indifferent complexity. "I see," she said. "I didn't want to tell you until I was certain." "And now you're certain." "Yes." She stood there in this hallway for a moment with her tea and her thoughts and the quiet. Then she continued to her room. She closed the door. She set the mug on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed, and she pressed her palms flat on her knees, and she stayed very still while she processed the particular physics of this information, the way it simultaneously confirmed everything she feared and made the calculation she'd been running for 8 months completely irrelevant. Travis had followed her here. Travis knew where she was, which meant the loose tile and the rubber band and the slowly growing number behind it were no longer the operative problem. The operative problem was 32 floors below her, in the dark, watching the building. She did not sleep easily that night. She lay in the dark and listened to the building settle and thought about choices and margins and the specific kind of trap that feels different from the trap you came from, even when the walls are just as close. In the morning, she walked out of her room to find Lucien already at the kitchen counter with coffee and his phone, and the specific compact tension of a man who had been awake earlier than he'd intended and had used the extra time to become more dangerous rather than less. Across from him, sitting on the couch with his ankle on his knee and an expression of studied boredom, was a man she had never seen before. Broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his 40s, with a face that looked like it had negotiated several hard surfaces in the course of its career. He was reading something on his phone with a deliberateness that made it clear he was aware of her the moment she entered the room. "Evelyn," Lucien said. He didn't look up from his own phone. "This is Marco. He handles security." Marco glanced up and nodded at her with an economy of social energy that communicated professional attention and zero personal investment. "Marco has some information about Travis Cole," Lucien said, "and about a detective Raymond Mercer." He set his phone face down on the counter and finally looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that she hadn't seen there before. Not warm, exactly, but the particular quality of attention that a person gives to something they've realized is more important to them than they'd initially accounted for. "You should hear this." Evelyn poured herself coffee. She sat down at the counter across from him. She looked at Marco. "Tell me," she said. Marco uncrossed his ankle and sat forward, and he began to talk. And as he talked, Evelyn Hart felt the floor of every assumption she'd made about her own situation, about Travis, about her own culpability, about the shape of the danger she'd been living inside, shift beneath her feet in a way she had no preparation for. Travis Cole was not just her ex-boyfriend. Travis Cole had been feeding information to a detective Raymond Mercer for the past 14 months. Information about the diner, about the neighborhood, about the peripheral edges of Lucien DeMarco's operations that happened to overlap with the geography of Evelyn's daily life. She had been, without knowing it, a point on a map that someone else was drawing, an anchor point in a surveillance effort aimed at someone else entirely. She had not just been unlucky, she had been placed. The coffee in her hands was hot. She held on to it carefully. "He didn't know me before he started dating me," she said. Her voice was very flat. "No," Marco said. "He knew of you, the diner, the location, the rest followed." A pause. "He's not smart enough to have designed it. Mercer designed it. Cole was a tool." The specific cold of this information was different from the cold she was used to. She'd been cold with fear before, cold with pain, cold with the exhaustion of living at the margin of someone else's violence. This was the cold of a different kind of equation. The cold of realizing that your suffering had been, in part, a function of someone else's strategy. That the casual cruelty you'd endured had been, in part, useful to someone. She set the mug down. She pressed her fingers flat on the counter. "He was using me," she said, "to get close to—" She stopped, looked at Lucien. Lucien looked back at her. His expression was controlled, precisely controlled, in a way that told her the control was doing a lot of work. "I didn't know," she said. "I know you didn't." "When did you figure out—" "3 days ago," he said. "I needed to verify before I said anything to you." Evelyn stared at the counter. She went through it backward. The timeline, the logic, the pieces she should have seen and hadn't because you don't look for the frame when you're too busy surviving what's inside it. The job at the diner. Travis showing up a month in. The progression that had felt like circumstance. None of it had been circumstance. She stood up from the stool. She walked to the window and looked out at the city, gray and wet and enormous in the morning light, and she stood there with her arms crossed and her jaw tight and the specific controlled stillness of a woman who was not going to fall apart because falling apart required energy she did not have and time she was not sure she could spare. Behind her, she heard Lucien stand, heard him say something quiet to Marco, heard footsteps moving toward the hallway, and then the quiet snick of a door and then the sound of only one other person in the room. Evelyn. Don't. Her voice came out low, contained. Give me a minute. He gave her the minute. She stood at the window and watched the city and breathed. Counted breaths the way she used to count dollars. Slowly, with the kind of discipline that comes from practicing it in harder moments than this one. Her reflection in the glass was faint in the morning light. Just an outline. Just a shape. When she turned around, her face was clear. What does Mercer want? She asked. Everything, Lucian said. He's been building a case for 3 years. He wants the ports, the operations, the names. He wants the family. A pause. He wants me. And Travis was a proximity tool. Get close to you. Stay near the diner. Maintain access to the neighborhood. Report any movement, any meetings. Standard low-level surveillance work dressed up as a relationship. His voice was perfectly even, but she watched his jaw. Mercer didn't brief Cole on the full picture. Cole thought he was doing some casual CI work for cash. He had no idea what he'd actually built or who he'd put in the middle of it. Evelyn absorbed this. So Mercer is the real problem. Mercer becomes the real problem in about 72 hours, Lucien said. He's moving faster than we expected. We picked up activity this morning. He's preparing to file for warrants on 3 of our legitimate operations. If he gets the warrants, he'll move on the ports within the week. She looked at him. What does that mean for me? It means, Lucien said carefully, that you are currently a known associate of mine by proximity, living in this building, and if Mercer moves when we expect him to move, you become a person he will want to talk to. The room was very quiet. I'm a waitress, she said. You were, Lucien said. 48 hours ago, this was a simpler situation. Travis was a violent ex-boyfriend, and you needed to get out of a bad circumstance. That is still true, but it's no longer the whole truth. His voice hadn't risen. It never rose, but it had weight. You are inside something now, Evelyn. I need you to understand that. She stood in the middle of his penthouse on the 32nd floor with the city spread out behind her and looked at the man who had opened a car door in a rainstorm and said, "Get in." And she felt, with terrifying clarity, the full texture of the decision she had made 5 nights ago. She had walked away from one trap, and she had walked, with her eyes not entirely open, directly into another one. Except this one was different in ways she was still cataloging. This one had given her coffee in the morning, and a room with a lock and an art studio she hadn't asked for. This one had told her the truth. What do you need from me? She asked, and her voice was very steady, steadier than she felt, steadier than she had any right to be given the specific geometry of the situation. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. Nothing you don't choose to give, he said. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have right now. She looked at him. He looked at her. The city breathed against the glass behind her. Somewhere below, in the cold Chicago morning, a detective named Mercer was signing paperwork and tightening a net that had her name on the periphery of it. And a man named Travis Cole was standing outside a building he had no idea was about to become the epicenter of something much larger than any of them had planned. And Evelyn Hart, who had been surviving on math and discipline and the specific kind of hope that doesn't announce itself, stood in the wreckage of every safe assumption she'd had left and made her decision. Tell me everything, she said. All of it. From the beginning. Lucien's eyes held hers for one more beat. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and he sat down. And he began to talk. And as he talked, she felt the last exit she'd been tracking quietly close behind her, not like a trap closing, but like a door she had chosen to let shut. And the difference between those two things, she was beginning to understand, was the only kind of freedom she had left. He talked for 2 hours. Evelyn sat across from him at that kitchen counter with her coffee going cold beside her and her hands flat on the surface in front of her. And she listened the way she used to listen in school before money got complicated and survival started requiring more bandwidth than learning. With her whole body. With the particular stillness of someone who understands that the information coming at them is load-bearing and cannot afford to be misheard. Lucien talked about the ports first, the infrastructure, not in the way that someone explains a criminal operation to someone they're trying to impress, but in the way a man explains the architecture of his own life when he has decided, for reasons he hasn't fully articulated even to himself, that a specific person deserves to understand it. Dry, precise, without ceremony. Import routes, shell companies, the network of legitimate businesses that functioned as both genuine enterprises and convenient financial topography. The relationship between the DeMarco family's operations and the city's political infrastructure, not corrupt in the cartoonish sense of briefcases of cash, but corrupt in the structural sense, the kind of corruption that lives in zoning approvals and union contracts, and the selective enforcement of ordinances that everyone pretends are enforced equally. Then he talked about Mercer. Detective Raymond Mercer had been with organized crime investigations for 11 years. He was 43, divorced, with a reputation for thoroughness that his colleagues in the department read as obsession and his superiors read as results. He had been building the DeMarco case for 34 months. He had turned 3 low-level associates into informants. He had burned through 2 of them when they were identified, and the third, a port manager named Desmond who had been on the DeMarco payroll for 6 years, had gone silent 4 days ago in a way that suggested he'd either gotten cold feet or gotten a visit. Travis Cole had been Mercer's 4th play. Not an informant in the traditional sense. Travis didn't have access to anything operational. He was a geographic anchor, a surveillance asset with legs. Put him next to Evelyn, who worked 2 blocks from a building Lucien used for meetings, and you had a human tripwire with a plausible cover story and no idea he was being managed. He was a tool, Evelyn said. She said it again, not because she hadn't heard it the first time, but because saying it out loud was different from hearing it said. It changed the texture of the last 8 months in her hands, made them simultaneously less personal and more enraging. Yes, Lucien said. And Mercer knew about me specifically. He knew your name, your address, your schedule. Lucien paused with the precision of a man choosing how much weight to put on the next sentence. He knew about the money you were saving. The kitchen was very quiet. How? Evelyn said. Travis reported it. Found the tile at some point, reported the amount, reported the timeline. His voice was even, controlled. Mercer noted it as evidence of a transient subject, someone who might relocate before his timeline closed. He factored it into his scheduling. She stared at the counter, the grout between the tiles. The small imperfection in the stone surface near the edge, where something had once been set down too hard. He was watching the clock on me, she said, to make sure I didn't leave the city before he moved. Yes. She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth, the specific controlled breathing of someone who is managing something too large for the room. And Travis knew about this. Travis knew you had money saved. He didn't know why Mercer wanted to know. He thought it was standard background intelligence. Lucien folded his hands on the counter. Travis Cole is not a complex person, Evelyn. He was violent and territorial and small. Mercer found the edge of that smallness and used it. That doesn't make the 8 months any shorter, she said. No, Lucien said. It doesn't. She pushed back from the counter and stood and went to the window again. The city was fully awake now. Mid-morning traffic on the streets below, the specific gray brightness of Chicago under cloud cover, the lake somewhere to the east invisible behind the density of buildings. She pressed 2 fingers against the glass. The cold came through immediately. What's your play? She asked. Her back was still to him. We move on Travis tonight, Lucien said, quietly. Give him the choice to disappear permanently or face consequences that are also permanent. A pause. He'll take the first option. And Mercer. Mercer is more complicated. She heard his chair shift. He was standing now. She could tell by the change in where his voice was coming from. If he files for those warrants, the legal process becomes a problem regardless of what else happens. We can slow it, but not stop it through legitimate channels. And if we address it through other channels, we generate attention we don't want. So you need time. We need time. She turned from the window. He was standing near the counter, and in the morning light, his face had the particular quality of a man who was not in the habit of explaining himself and was finding it neither as difficult nor as irritating as he'd expected. What do you need me to do? She asked. Nothing, he said. This isn't your problem to solve. It became my problem when Mercer put my name in a file. That's not Lucien. She said his name the way you say a word to stop a sentence, clean and without aggression. Stop performing the thing where you don't want me involved. You already told me everything. That is involvement. He looked at her for a moment. Something behind his eyes did a small, quiet reckoning. Stay in the building for the next 48 hours, he said. Don't contact anyone connected to your previous life. Don't reach out to anyone about housing or work or anything that creates a traceable communication. He paused. And if Marco or anyone on my team asks you to move to a different location, you move without debate. Fine. Fine, he repeated, as if he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. I said fine. She picked up her cold coffee and walked to the microwave and put it in for 45 seconds with the specific economy of a person who was not going to let a small thing like the collapse of her entire situation stop her from finishing her morning coffee. The microwave hummed. For reasons he did not examine at the time, Lucien DeMarco watched that microwave cycle through its 45 seconds with the expression of a man who was revising a calculation about something. The next 36 hours were the tightest Evelyn had spent since moving into the penthouse. The building's ambient energy changed, subtly, the way weather pressure changes before a system moves in. More men in the lobby, shorter conversations on phones. Lucien gone from 6 in the morning until well past midnight, returning both nights with the compressed stillness of someone who had been making decisions all day, whose weight he was still carrying home. She drew. She didn't know what else to do with the hours, and the art studio was there, and the pencils were there, and her hands knew how to do it, even when her mind was elsewhere. She drew the Chicago skyline from memory, not as it looked from the penthouse window in its polished, elevated geometry, but as it had looked from the street in front of Manny's diner, slightly obscured by the angle of adjacent buildings, the glow of the sign in the foreground, the way the neon red and violet mixed with the wet pavement reflection into something that looked more like a painting than a real place. She drew it 3 times. The third time it started looking like something. On the second morning, Marco came to the studio door. Mr. DeMarco needs you in the main room, he said. Not unkindly, not kindly either, just factual. She put the pencil down and followed him. Lucien was standing at the window. He had his phone in his hand but wasn't looking at it. He was looking at the city in the way he looked at it when he was processing something that hadn't resolved into language yet. She had learned in a short time to read the difference between Lucien standing at the window thinking and Lucien standing at the window having already thought and now carrying the result. This was the second one. Travis is gone, he said. She stopped in the center of the room. Gone as in on a plane to Juneau, Alaska, as of 4 this morning, with a new name and a very clear understanding of the consequences of returning. He turned from the window. His jaw was slightly off its usual alignment, the micro-tension she'd started recognizing as the seam where his control was working hardest. He took the option, without argument. In fact, he volunteered several pieces of information we hadn't asked for. About Mercer. About Mercer. Lucien set the phone face down on the arm of the chair beside him. Evelyn, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before you react. The specific phrasing of that landed wrong. She felt it before she understood it. A cold displacement in her chest. The physical sensation of a floor shifting. Tell me, she said. Travis gave us Mercer's full file on this operation. His voice was very even. The surveillance logs, the informant reports, the photographs. He paused. There are photographs of you and me taken from outside this building over the past week. Mercer has been building a secondary file alongside his primary case. Another pause, fractionally longer. The secondary file argues that you are not incidental to the DeMarco operation. It argues that you are a recruited asset. The room was perfectly still. He's going to say I work for you, Evelyn said. He's going to say you've been a DeMarco intelligence asset embedded at the diner for an indeterminate period. That the relationship between you and Travis was a managed cover to explain your presence in the neighborhood, that you are, in essence, an operative. Lucien's voice did not change registers. That steadiness, she realized, was the most frightening thing about it. He will file this simultaneously with the warrant application. The narrative will be, the DeMarco organization plants a woman in a civilian diner, she develops a relationship with an unwitting police informant, and when the informant's usefulness ends, the organization moves against him. Evelyn sat down. Not a choice. Her legs simply made the decision independent of any instruction. He's using me as the story, she said. I'm not incidental to his case. I'm the human face of it. A woman who appears to have been victimized, who is sympathetic on the surface, who is actually a knowing participant. That's a more compelling narrative than port logistics and financial documents. Lucian crouched down so he was at her eye level, not crowding her, just removing the height differential. Juries respond to that kind of story. So do journalists. Mercer knows this. She looked at her hands in her lap. She was aware of a sound she hadn't expected to hear from herself. Not crying, not even close to crying, something lower and more structural than that. Something in her chest that was the sound of the last safe assumption finally going. I have no defense, she said. I'm here, in this building. I've been here for 6 days. I have no money, no apartment, no employment history that doesn't place me in that neighborhood for 2 years. She looked up. He doesn't have to prove I'm guilty. He just has to make me look like I might be, and a jury does the rest. Yes, Lucian said. He didn't soften it. She was grateful for that. Why are you telling me this now? Because Mercer moves in 40 hours. He held her gaze. And because you deserve to know the shape of what you're in before you decide what you do next. She stood up. The motion was abrupt, her body needing to be vertical, needing the physical fact of standing as evidence that she was still making choices. She walked to the bar cart and poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass she didn't drink, just held. What are my options? She said. You leave now, today. I have resources, a clean identity, documentation, a destination outside Mercer's jurisdiction. You disappear before he files and you become a loose end he can't locate rather than a defendant he can build a case around. He paused. The downside is that disappearing looks like guilt, and you'd be starting over in a place with no connections. And no, what's the second option? A silence. You stay, Lucy, and said, we fight it. My legal team is the best in the city. If we can get ahead of the narrative before Mercer files, we can shape the counterstory. An abused woman who sought safety from a violent partner happens to have found it in the wrong building. That's sympathetic. That's defensible. He paused. But it requires you to be visible, to talk to lawyers, potentially to investigators, to be part of a public-facing effort to discredit Mercer's secondary file. It requires me to bet my entire future on your lawyers. Yes. She drank the whiskey. It landed in her empty stomach and spread warmth in the specific way that warmth reaches things that have been cold for a long time. There's a third option, she said. He looked at her, waiting. Mercer's case exists because of his file, she said. The secondary file. The one with the photos, the narrative, the argument that I'm an asset. If that file doesn't exist when he tries to use it, Evelyn, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm thinking out loud. I know what you're thinking out loud about. His voice was measured. And I'm telling you that the answer to that particular thought is no. Not because of any strategic concern, because you are not going to become something you aren't to survive something that happened to you without your consent. He stood. That is not a line we cross. Are we clear? She looked at him. The flatness in his voice was absolute. Not threatening, nothing like Travis's flatness, which had always been the flat of a man gathering himself for impact. This was the flat of a principal. Clear, she said. But you should know I wasn't going to sit here and do nothing. I know you weren't. Something that was not quite warmth moved behind his eyes. That's not what I'm asking for. I'm asking for 40 hours and a conversation with my lead attorney. Fine. She set the empty glass down. Set up the meeting. He picked up his phone. And then Marco came through the hallway door without knocking, which in itself was enough to recalibrate the room's entire atmosphere. Marco did not come through doors without knocking unless the information was not the kind that could wait for the social courtesy of a knock. We have a problem, Marco said. Lucien looked at him. Which kind? The kind that's already in motion. Marco held up his own phone. On the screen was a photograph, a grainy telephoto, the kind of image that was not meant to be beautiful, just accurate. It showed the front entrance of the building. It showed Evelyn, from 6 days ago, walking through the front door with her apron under her arm and her split lip and her wet sneakers. And standing on the opposite side of the street, barely in frame, was a figure in a dark coat with a camera. This is from 3 days ago, Marco said. We missed it. Where did it come from? Lucien asked. That's the problem. Marco lowered the phone. His expression had the quality of a man delivering news he'd spent the walk here wishing was different. It came from inside. The temperature of the room changed. Evelyn felt it the way you feel a pressure change, not in the ears but in the body, a systemic adjustment. "Inside the building," Lucian said, very quietly. "Inside the operation," Marco said. "Someone on the inside knew about the photograph, knew it existed, and sent it." He paused. The file transfer came from Desmond's access credentials, the port manager. "Desmond went silent 4 days ago," Evelyn said. She didn't know why she said it. The information was there, and her mind connected it before she'd decided to speak. Both men looked at her. "Desmond didn't go cold," Marco said slowly. "Desmond went to Mercer, not as a frightened informant, as an active one. He's been inside for longer than we thought." He looked at Lucien with an expression that carried the weight of delivering news to someone who did not often receive it. "He's been running parallel, feeding us the cover story about Mercer's timeline, while feeding Mercer the real movement from inside. The operation we've been protecting for the last week, the ports, the legal countermove, everything we've been planning in this building." Lucien had gone very still. "Mercer already has it," Evelyn said. "Mercer already has it," Marco confirmed. He set the phone face up on the coffee table between them all. "He's not moving in 40 hours. He moved this morning. The warrants were filed at 8:47. We got the notification 11 minutes ago." A pause. "Lucien, they're coming for the building." The next 30 seconds were the loudest silence Evelyn had ever stood inside. Lucien didn't move for 3 of them. He stood in the center of his penthouse, with the city behind him, and his phone in his hand and his face doing nothing visible while something massive rearranged itself behind it. Then he looked at Marco. "Clear level 30, he said. "Move everything to the secondary location. You have 20 minutes. The legal files, physical copies only, nothing digital leaves through the building's network." He was already moving, not rushing, not panicking, just in motion with the precise purposefulness of a man who had rehearsed contingencies that he'd always hoped were academic. "Get Carla on the phone. Tell her to file the counter-application now, not when we discussed. Now." "Lucien. Now Marco." He looked at Evelyn. His eyes had the quality they sometimes had at 2 in the morning, stripped of everything performative, just direct and clear and carrying their full weight. "Can you move fast?" "Yes," she said. "You're coming with me." "Where?" "Somewhere that isn't here." He was already crossing the room. "And Evelyn—" He stopped and turned back to her for exactly the length of time required to say one true thing. "I'm sorry. This is not what I meant for you." She crossed the room to him, stopped 2 feet away. "I know," she said. "Let's go." She had nothing to pack. She had arrived with an apron and a name tag and the clothes on her back, and she was leaving with approximately the same inventory plus 6 days of complicated education about who she was dealing with and what that meant for every choice still ahead of her. The elevator descended. Marco was already on his phone. 2 men she'd seen in passing but never spoken to were moving with rapid efficiency down the hallway. She could see through the closing elevator doors, carrying physical files in dark bags with the practiced speed of people who had drilled for exactly this. In the elevator, Lucien stood beside her and looked forward at the steel doors. She looked at the faint, warped reflection of them both in the brushed metal. 2 people standing close enough that their reflections overlapped at the edges. "The person who sold you out," she said. "Desmond." "Yes." "He was with your family for 6 years." "Yes?" His voice was very flat. "Were you close?" A pause. 4 floors passing in silence. "I trusted him," Lucien said finally, which was not the same as the answer she'd asked for, but was, she suspected, the more accurate one. The lobby arrived. Through the glass front of the building, she could see the street, ordinary looking, morning pedestrians, a delivery truck, a black sedan double parked. Nothing yet. But somewhere in the city's machinery, something with her name on it was already in motion, already signed, already irreversible. Lucien put a hand at the small of her back. Not possessive, not romantic, just directional. The touch of a man moving a person he was responsible for through a space he was no longer certain was safe. They walked out of the building into the cold Chicago morning. The sedan at the curb had a different driver than the one she'd ridden with before. This man was younger, tighter wound, with the eyes of someone running threat calculations on every person within 50 meters. She got in. Lucien got in beside her. The door closed, and as the sedan pulled away from the building she'd spent 6 days believing was the safest place she'd ever been, Evelyn Hart looked back through the rear window at the glass tower receding behind them and understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has stopped lying to themselves, that nothing about the next phase of her life was going to resemble anything she had survived before. She was not the woman from the alley anymore. She was not the waitress with the loose tile and the rubber band and the patient math. She was something the last 6 days had made without asking her permission. A woman whose name was in a federal file, whose face was in a surveillance photograph, who was sitting in a car with the most dangerous man in Chicago while his empire came apart at a seam that someone on the inside had been quietly pulling for longer than anyone had known. The city moved past the windows in its gray, indifferent morning. She turned forward. She breathed. And somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the fear and the fury and the cold exhaustion of a woman who had been surviving other people's designs on her life since before she had the language to name it, something else had begun to harden, quiet, purposeful, and something entirely her own. That thought finished itself somewhere on the expressway, headed south, while the city peeled away behind them and the sedan moved through morning traffic with the particular urgency of a vehicle that was being driven by someone who had been told where to go and how fast to get there without being told why, and had the discipline not to ask. Evelyn sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward, and the cold clarity she'd felt in the lobby still present behind her sternum, not warming, not fading, just sitting there like something that had finally decided to stay. Lucien was on his phone. He'd been on it since they got in the car, speaking in brief exchanges that she could hear the shape of without catching most of the words. Names, numbers, locations compressed into the kind of shorthand that develops between people who have spent years communicating under time pressure. His posture was upright, controlled, but she had spent enough days reading the microgeography of this man's body to know that beneath the suit and the composure, he was running calculations at a speed and depth that most people would have called panic if it had any visible surface expression at all. It didn't. That was the thing about Lucien DeMarco. The more serious the situation, the more completely he became the suit. She found that steadying rather than alarming, which told her something about how much she'd changed in 6 days that she wasn't ready to look at directly yet. The sedan exited the expressway at a ramp she didn't recognize and moved through a grid of industrial streets, warehouses, loading docks, the flat, utilitarian geography of the city's working edges, where the architecture stopped trying to look like anything and just functioned. They pulled into a facility that presented as a logistics company, generic signage, a parking lot with trucks, a building with no windows on the ground floor, and every appearance of being exactly what it claimed to be. The driver said nothing, got out, opened their door. Inside, the facility was different from its exterior, the way a set is different from a stage, the surface maintained for the audience that never got this far. And then, past the threshold, the real structure. A secured interior that was clean and organized and clearly not about logistics in any conventional sense. Reinforced doors, a communication setup in the central room that made the penthouse look casual. Men Evelyn didn't recognize moving with the focused efficiency of people executing a plan rather than reacting to one. A woman in her late 40s met them in the entrance corridor. She was compact, precise, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a tablet in her hand, and the expression of someone who operated at a level of cognitive throughput that made most conversations feel like they were moving slowly. "Carla," Lucien said. "I filed at 9:12, Carla said without preamble. We got ahead of the narrative by about 40 minutes. His application and ours hit the clerk's office inside the same hour, which means neither story is clean and both become contested. That's the best scenario we could have hoped for, given the timeline compression." She looked at Evelyn with the direct clinical appraisal of a woman who assessed variables for a living. "You're Evelyn Hart." "Yes," Evelyn said. "I'm going to need 2 hours with you this afternoon. Everything. The relationship with Cole, the timeline, the employment history, what you knew and when, and what you didn't know and when." She looked back at Lucien. "She needs to be completely credible on every detail. Mercer's secondary narrative falls apart if her account is airtight and sympathetic. It holds if there's any gap." "There are no gaps," Evelyn said. Carla looked at her again. Something in her expression shifted. Not warmth, but a species of professional respect. Good. We'll see. She turned back to Lucien. Desmond. Lucien's jaw moved. Handled. Not yet, Carla said. That's why I'm saying it. Marco's team located him 40 minutes ago. He's at a hotel in Wicker Park under a name we didn't give him, which means Mercer gave it to him, which means Mercer expected us to look and wanted Desmond findable. She paused. This is bait, Lucien. The room did something very quiet. Mercer wants us to move on Desmond, Lucien said. It was not a question. Mercer wants you to move on Desmond visibly, on his timeline, in a way he can document and add to the existing warrant application as evidence of ongoing criminal conduct. Carla's voice was very dry. Which means, whatever you're planning to do about Desmond, you do not do it in the next 72 hours, and you do not do it in a way that produces any observable event. Lucien said nothing for 3 seconds. Fine. Not fine. I need your word that this doesn't move without my clearance. Another pause. Longer. Evelyn watched the side of his face and saw the specific effort of a man for whom patience with constraints that weren't his own was a practiced rather than natural state. You have it, he said. Carla nodded once and moved off down the corridor with the momentum of a person who had 17 more things to address before lunch. Lucien turned to Evelyn. There are rooms in the back. Clean clothes, food, everything you need. Get a few hours if you can. I don't need a few hours. You haven't slept more than 4 hours in 2 days. Neither have you. He looked at her. She looked at him. The corridor was narrow enough that they were closer than the penthouse's generous square footage had usually allowed. And at this proximity, she could see the fatigue he was carrying in the specific way she'd learned to read it. Not in his face, which cooperated completely with the performance of composure, but in his eyes, which did not perform composure so much as contain it. And the containing had a cost that showed in the quality of stillness there. 2 hours, she said, and then I'm in that room with Carla. 2 hours, he agreed. She slept for 90 minutes on a cot in a room that smelled like industrial cleaning product and contained nothing decorative. She woke up completely. No gradual surfacing, the way she'd trained herself to wake up during the Travis years when the sound of a key in the lock at 2 a.m. required immediate full function. She lay on the cot for 30 seconds, looked at the ceiling, took inventory of what she knew and what she needed to do and in what order. Then she got up and went to find Carla. The 2 hours with Carla were the most rigorous conversation Evelyn had ever had. The attorney worked chronologically, methodically, with a particular focus on the moments that would look worst in a narrative built to damage her. The moment she got in Lucien's car, the moment she entered the building, the decision to stay past the first night. For each one, Carla pressed on the logic, the emotional state, the visible evidence. Not to poke holes, to fill them, to ensure that every gap was accounted for before Mercer's people found it and furnished their own version of what was inside it. Evelyn answered everything, clean, direct, without softening. She had spent years managing other people's perceptions of her damage. She had become, by necessity, very good at telling true things in the order and framing that produced the most accurate picture. This was that skill at its full extension. By the end, Carla sat back and looked at her with the expression of someone checking a structure for weaknesses and not finding them. You're very composed for someone in your situation, Carla said. I've had practice, Evelyn said. It'll help. Carla closed her tablet. Mercer's case rests on the idea that you're too convenient to be innocent, that a frightened waitress doesn't accidentally end up in the penthouse of the DeMarco operation without being part of it. We need to make your presence feel inevitable, given your circumstances, not suspicious. She paused. The art studio helps. I'm sorry? You put an art studio in a guest room the third day you were there. Carla looked at her steadily. That's not how an organization deploys an asset. That's how a person treats someone they're trying to take care of. If I put that in front of a jury, it reads a very specific way. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. You're going to use the fact that I'm going to use every true thing that works in your favor. Yes. Carla stood. That's my job. The afternoon moved quickly. The facility hummed with the constant motion of people managing a crisis that had multiple simultaneous pressure points, and Evelyn stayed close enough to the center of it to understand what was happening without being inside the operational decisions, which were not hers to make, and which she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge she didn't yet have the information or context to contribute to. She was in the main communications room at 4:17 in the afternoon when the first real break happened. Marco came in from the exterior with his jaw set and a phone in his hand displaying a text thread. He showed it to Lucien without speaking. Lucien read it. He read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the table with the particular care of someone setting down something that, if handled wrong, might detonate. Mercer made contact with Desmond again an hour ago, Lucien said. He wasn't talking to Evelyn specifically. He was talking to the room. Desmond is spooked. He's been told the operation is moving faster than planned because of the counterfiling, and he's been told he needs to produce something concrete in the next 24 hours or his arrangement with Mercer gets restructured. He paused. Mercer told Desmond to get access to the secondary location. This location, Marco said. This location. The room processed that. Evelyn processed it a half-second faster than she expected to, the logic assembling itself with the cold speed that had been operating in her since the lobby that morning. Desmond doesn't know where this location is, she said. No, Lucien said. He looked at her. He'll have to be led here. Which means someone from the inside tells him where we are. She held his gaze. Which means Mercer already has a second contact inside your operation. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of people arrive at the same conclusion simultaneously, and nobody wants to say it out loud because saying it makes it permanent. Marco said it. We have 2 leaks. The next 3 hours were the most operationally intense Evelyn had witnessed. Lucien moved through the facility with the compressed focus of a man excising something from a system he'd built and trusted, and had now been compromised at a level that required him to treat every node as suspect until proven otherwise. Conversations happened in pairs, then in groups, then in rapid succession as the geometry of who knew what and when produced a narrowing set of possibilities. She stayed out of the way. She watched. She filed. At 7:48 p.m., they had a name. A man named Curtis, who had been with the DeMarco operation for 4 years, who handled physical logistics at the secondary facility, who had access to the location's address in exactly the capacity required to have passed it to Mercer's network. Curtis, who was, according to the timeline Marco worked backward through the communication records, the secondary leak. Curtis, who was, at this moment, still inside the facility. Evelyn was in the corridor outside the communications room when she heard Lucien's voice through the partially open door. Not raised, not angry in any register she'd heard from him before, but carrying a quality that was worse than both of those things. The absolute zero of a man who had stopped generating any heat at all because the cold was more efficient. You've been in my house for 4 years, Lucien said. She didn't hear Curtis's response clearly, only the pitch of it, defensive, breaking at the edges, the voice of a man who had believed until the moment of confrontation that he would never be in this room having this conversation. Mercer offered you what? Lucien said. Protection, relocation, money. A pause. And you weighed 4 years against whatever number he put on the table. Another pause. Look at me when I'm talking to you. She moved away from the door. She didn't need to hear the rest. She had the shape of it, and the shape of it was the same shape that betrayal always had. Small at the origin, enormous at the consequence, and somewhere in the middle the specific human moment when a person decided that loyalty was negotiable and then spent the rest of the calculation trying to convince themselves they'd done the math correctly. At 9 p.m., Lucien found her in the room with the cot. She was sitting on it with her knees pulled up and her sketchbook, which had somehow migrated from the penthouse to this facility in someone's bag, she suspected Marco, open on her lap. She'd been drawing without thinking about it, the pencil moving through her unresolved energy the way running water moves through available channels. He sat in the chair across from her, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, and looked at the floor for a moment. Curtis is handled, he said. I know. Tomorrow morning, Lucien. She looked up from the sketchbook. Tell me what's happening tomorrow. He looked at her. The room was very small and the lighting was institutional, and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, slightly worn at the edges. Not broken, not even close, But the seams of the composure were visible in a way they hadn't been in the penthouse with its high ceilings and careful amber lighting. Mercer's going to move on the ports tomorrow night, he said. Carla's counterfiling buys us a legal argument, but not an injunction. The warrants stand while they're contested, which means he can execute while we fight the framing in court. He paused. If he gets into the port operations with active warrants, he has physical evidence that supersedes any narrative battle. The legal case becomes secondary. So you need to move before he does. We need to move tonight. He said it carefully, placing each word. There's an event tomorrow. A charity gala at the Morrison Grand. Mercer is attending, officially, as a guest. The gala is hosted by a civic foundation that has long-standing ties to the city's political infrastructure, several members of which have overlapping interests with both Mercer's investigation and our legitimate business holdings. He met her eyes. It's a neutral space with 50 witnesses and no tactical advantage for either side, which makes it exactly the kind of space where a public-facing resolution becomes possible. Iraman. She understood what he was describing. You're going to be in the same room as the detective who has an active warrant on your operation. Yes. And you think that's a better option than... I think, Lucien said, that the only move left that doesn't end in a direct confrontation on Mercer's terms is to change the terrain. His voice was quiet and deliberate. He wants the ports. He wants the documents. He wants the arrest. If I'm standing in a ballroom full of city officials and journalists, and Carla has the counterfiling in every major press inbox by 9 a.m., the arrest becomes a spectacle he can't control, and the documents become a contested evidentiary question rather than a closed case. A pause. It's the only play. She looked at him. She looked at the sketchbook in her lap without seeing it. You need me there, she said. He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. Carla thinks your presence changes the optics significantly, he said finally. A frightened waitress hiding in a safe house looks guilty. A woman who shows up to a public event on the arm of the man she's been accused of working for in front of witnesses challenges the entire narrative Mercer's been building. He paused. But I'm not asking you to do this. I want that to be absolutely clear. This is not a condition of anything. Evelyn closed the sketchbook. She set it on the cot beside her. She looked at the floor between them for a moment. A few feet of industrial concrete that represented, in some abstract geometry, the distance between who she had been when she walked into Manny's diner 8 months ago and who she was in this moment, in this room, making this calculation. She thought about Travis, about the alley, about the loose tile and the rubber band and the $4,212. She thought about the studio with the good pencils that someone had assembled with research. She thought about 2 cups of tea at a kitchen counter at 2 a.m, and the way a man's jaw had tightened when he looked at dried blood on her face, and the very particular quality of a person who tells you the truth because they've decided you're capable of handling it. What do I wear? She said. Something happened in Lucien's face. Brief, controlled, but real. There's a car going to a specific address in 40 minutes, he said. Everything you need will be there. She nodded, stood up, picked up the sketchbook. Lucien. He looked at her. If this goes wrong tomorrow night, it won't. If it does. She held his gaze. Whatever happens to you, I want you to know that I walked into this with my eyes open. Whatever Mercer says, whatever his file says, I made every choice I made on my own. His eyes held hers for a long moment. Something in them that she had no clean word for. Not gratitude, not affection in any uncomplicated sense, but the specific recognition that passes between 2 people who have seen each other clearly and have not looked away. I know, he said, very quietly. She walked out of the room. The car was waiting in 40 minutes exactly. She got in, and it moved through the dark Chicago streets toward the address, and she sat in the back with the city sliding past, and her hands steady in her lap, and her mind running clean, and she understood something with the full, irreversible weight of understanding that has no going back. She was not being rescued anymore. She was choosing. The Morrison Grand rose ahead of them through the rain-washed windshield, all marble and glass and blazing interior light, the kind of building that existed to remind the city of the distance between those who made decisions and those who lived inside them. Valets in dark jackets moved along the front entrance. Guests in formal wear arrived in cars that cost more than years of her labor. Camera flashes from the press line strobed across the wet pavement in bursts of cold white light. Evelyn looked at it through the window. She thought about what Carla had said, about narratives, about the story that a room full of witnesses would carry out of that building tomorrow night, the story that would be in inboxes and on screens, and in the mouths of journalists who would decide what kind of woman she was before they'd spoken a word to her. She thought about a black card with a silver phone number. She thought about an open car door in a rainstorm. She thought about the specific quality of a person who asks who did that to you without flinching and waits for the real answer. The driver pulled to the curb. She looked at the building one more time. Then the hotel's secondary entrance door opened from the inside, and Lucien stepped out in a suit so dark it nearly vanished against the night behind him, and he looked at her through the glass with those eyes that did not perform anything. And she got out of the car, and the rain touched her face, and somewhere inside the Morrison Grand, Detective Raymond Mercer was sitting at a table with no idea that the variable he had factored as manageable was about to walk through the door. She crossed the wet pavement to Lucien. He looked at her for one moment, taking the full measure of her, the way he had that first night in the diner, with the particular directness that had nothing predatory in it and everything clear. And then he offered his arm. She took it. They walked toward the entrance. Inside, through the glass doors, she could already see the chandelier-lit ballroom, the crowd moving in its formal choreography, the architecture of an evening that was about to become something none of its planners had prepared for. The doors opened. The noise hit. Voices and music and the particular density of a room full of people who believed they controlled things. And then, across the ballroom floor, 40 feet away, Detective Raymond Mercer turned from his conversation and looked directly at the entrance, and his eyes found Evelyn Hart on the arm of the man he had spent 34 months building a case to destroy. And his face did something that was not anger and not surprise, but the specific recalculating stillness of a man who has just realized that the board he has been playing on is not the board he thought it was. Evelyn looked back at him. She did not look away. Lucien's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. Not possessive, not theatrical, just present, just the quiet weight of a person telling another person, I'm here in the only language that needed no translation. And then the crystal chandelier above the center of the ballroom shattered, not from age, not from accident, from the impact of something that had just come through the skylight above it at a velocity that had nothing to do with chance. And the sound that followed was not music and not conversation, but the specific catastrophic percussion of glass and metal and chaos arriving simultaneously from 3 directions at once. And the screaming started before the second chandelier fell. And Evelyn felt Lucien's hand pull her backward as the first gunshot cracked across the marble floor of the Morrison Grand Ballroom, and the evening became something that no one in that room was going to be able to control. That was the word her mind reached for in the half-second before everything became noise and motion and the specific chaos of a room full of people discovering simultaneously that the evening they'd dressed for was not the evening they were having. Evelyn felt Lucien's hand close around her wrist. Not her hand, her wrist, the grip of someone prioritizing speed over gentleness. And she was already moving with him before the second piece of chandelier hit the marble, glass exploding outward across the dance floor in a radius that sent the nearest guests stumbling backward into each other in a wave of formal wear and dropped champagne glasses and the high, fractured sounds of people whose threat response had never been tested against anything real. She did not stumble. She moved. That distinction felt important in a way she didn't have time to examine. Lucien pulled her left toward the ballroom's perimeter, away from the center where the chaos was densest. She registered things in fragments. A masked figure moving through the crowd from the east entrance. A second figure near the bar, the specific way the room's sound had changed from the ambient noise of a formal event to something with edges, something that had velocity and direction. 3 gunshots from across the ballroom, spaced, purposeful, screaming in the upper registers. The crash of a table overturning. Stay behind me, Lucien said. Not shouted. Said. Flat and direct over the noise like a frequency cut specifically to reach her. I see them, she said. Because she did. She had been mapping rooms since she was 19 years old, and this room, which she had mapped automatically from the moment they walked in, had 3 primary exits, 2 service corridors visible from her current position, and a stage platform at the south end that offered elevation and partial concealment. South stage, there's a service exit behind it. He looked at her for a fraction of a second. Processing. Then, go. They moved along the east wall. The crowd was flowing in multiple directions at once, the particular fluid dynamics of mass panic, which has no logic except the logic of bodies trying to create distance from perceived threat, and which made navigation both easier and harder than moving through a crowd that was organized. Easier because the space kept opening. Harder because the opened space was unpredictable, and the bodies filling it were not watching where they were going. Evelyn felt someone's elbow catch her shoulder. She absorbed it and kept moving. She felt broken glass under her shoe. The sound of it different from the crack of the chandelier, smaller, the sound of a champagne flute that had rolled from somewhere and been stepped on before she reached it. The heel of her shoe caught in a gap and she pulled it free without breaking stride and lost the heel entirely, the shoe going flat under her left foot, and she ran on both feet and didn't think about it. Lucian was a step ahead and a step to her left. He was moving with a controlled speed that she recognized as the speed of someone who had navigated spaces under hostile conditions before. Not running, not walking, the in-between pace that covered ground fastest while maintaining enough awareness to redirect. His eyes were not on the floor. They were on the room. She watched his shoulders instead of the room. She let his read of the space direct her the way you follow current in water. Not because you can't navigate yourself, but because swimming against available information is how you drown. They were 20 feet from the stage when the man stepped out from behind the curtain. He was not masked. That was the first thing. The masked figures had been the distraction, the choreographed chaos designed to empty the room, to scatter the witnesses, to give the real action its cover. This man was in a dark jacket, and he had a knife, not a gun, and he was not looking at Lucian. He was looking at Evelyn. She had time to understand that, and then he was moving. The next 4 seconds had a texture she would carry for a long time afterward. Not fear exactly. She had felt fear for years, she knew its geography, but something more primitive and more acute. The specific animal clarity of a body that has received a signal from its oldest systems and responded before the thinking mind caught up. She stepped left. Hard. The knife passed close enough that she felt air displacement against her forearm, and she got her right elbow up and drove it into the inside of his wrist the way physics dictated, the force going into the joint's weakest axis, the knife hand opening involuntarily, and then she drove the heel of her surviving shoe into the outside of his knee with everything she had in her. And the knee went wrong beneath him, and he went down sideways onto the stage stairs, and she was already past him when Lucien's hand closed on the man's collar, and the rest of that particular exchange was brief and conclusive, and she did not watch it. She pushed through the stage curtain, found the service corridor, heard Lucien's footsteps behind her 30 seconds later, and then his hand on the corridor door frame beside her, and she turned and looked at him. And they both stood in the narrow service corridor for exactly 3 seconds, breathing hard, while the ballroom noise filtered through the wall in a compressed, muffled version of itself. He looked at her arm. She looked down. A thin line across the outside of her forearm, shallow, the length of 2 fingers. The knife had made contact after all, the air displacement calculation slightly wrong. "It's not deep," she said. "I can see that." His voice was level. His eyes were not. The man at the stage. "I know," she said. "He was for me. Not for you." Lucien's jaw went to its tightest position. Mercer. Who else? She pressed the inside of her opposite wrist against the cut. Light pressure, reflex. Mercer didn't just want to arrest you. He wanted to discredit the counterfiling. A woman gets hurt at a public event while in the company of Lucien DeMarco. That's not a headline that helps Carla's narrative. She looked at him steadily. He staged this. He staged a raid on a charity event with civilian witnesses. He staged a raid that looks like a rival organization's attack, she said, which lands differently, which goes in the file as evidence of the danger surrounding DeMarco's operations and by extension anyone associated with them. She paused. I'm the anyone associated. He looked at her for a moment. In the narrow corridor this close, she could see the exact quality of what was happening behind his eyes. Not rage, not calculation, both of those things had a distinct surface signature she'd learned to read. This was something older and more structural. The look of a man who had made a decision that had put someone he did not want to put there into danger, and who was processing the cost of that with the full, unsparing honesty of a person who does not negotiate with facts. "I shouldn't have brought you here," he said. "You gave me the choice." "I shouldn't have framed it as a choice when I needed an outcome." She looked at the cut on her arm. The bleeding was minimal, already slowing, the body doing its competent, unheroic work of managing small damage. "Lucien, I knew what I was walking into." "That doesn't—" "It does." She looked up at him. "Don't do that. Don't take the choice back retroactively because it costs something. That's not respect. That's guilt wearing the clothes of care." He was quiet. The corridor hummed with the building's infrastructure. Somewhere beyond the wall, a siren started. Then another, the sound multiplying in the way it did when multiple response units arrived simultaneously. "Police?" she said. "Yes?" "Mercer's people or actual response?" "Both, probably." He straightened. The composure came back in layers, visible as it assembled. "We need to get ahead of this. Carla needs to know what happened before any report gets filed, and I need to be standing in that lobby talking to first responders before Mercer gets his version into any official account." He looked at her arm one more time. "Can you walk?" "I've been walking," she said. Something moved across his face, brief and human and not performed for any audience. "Yes," he said. "You have." They came out of the service corridor into the hotel's back hallway and moved toward the lobby. She had lost one heel and the cut on her arm had dried to a thin, dark line, and her dress, which had been selected by someone with access to a budget she still found disorienting, had a tear at the left seam where she'd moved too hard too fast. She was aware of how she looked. She made the calculation that how she looked was, for once, useful. A woman who had been in that ballroom, who had the physical evidence of it on her body, who walked out of the hotel's interior on her own feet without assistance. That was a story that Mercer could not have written. He had written her as a managed asset, a calculated operator. The woman who came out of the Morrison Grand looking like this was neither of those things. She was a witness. She was a survivor. She was, in the specific vocabulary that Carla had been building all day, exactly the most credible version of herself. In the lobby, the scene was organized chaos. Hotel staff directing shaken guests, a security team in conversation with the first responding officers, press who had been at the outdoor entrance trying to get through the doors. Carla was already there. Evelyn did not know how she had gotten there so fast and did not ask. Carla had the quality of certain people who are simply always already where they are needed, as if they move through time at a slightly different rate. Carla looked at Evelyn's arm, looked at her face, looked at her shoes. Then she looked at Lucien. "How bad?" Carla said. "Minor injuries, 4 confirmed by security," Lucien said. "No fatalities in the room." "The attackers?" "3 in custody," Carla said. "Hotel security and the responding units got them in the east corridor. 1 fled, 1 is being tracked." She looked back at Evelyn. "You need to talk to the responding officers. Now, before the scene gets muddied, tell them exactly what happened at the stage, what you saw, what you did, what order." Her voice was not unkind. It was efficient in the way that kindness sometimes had to be when there was work to do. Every detail you can give about the man who came at you specifically. "He wasn't masked," Evelyn said. Carla's eyes sharpened. "You're certain?" "I looked at his face for 4 seconds. I can describe him." Carla took out her phone and made a call in 2 words. Then she looked back at Evelyn. "This changes the filing. A targeted, unmasked attack on a civilian witness in a public venue moves this from organized crime activity to witness intimidation at minimum." She paused. Mercer's secondary file just became a liability for him. Because if he filed it and someone connected to his operation tried to hurt the subject of it, Evelyn said. "It looks like he knew you were going to be a problem for his case and tried to resolve it," Carla finished. "Which is not something a prosecutor or a judge or a press room will interpret generously." A beat. "We didn't plan this, but it's what happened." Evelyn looked at the lobby, at the disarray of an evening that had broken in the middle, at the guests in their formal wear, some of them with champagne still in hand from the reflexive way people grip familiar objects in unfamiliar situations. at the officers moving through the space with the focused procedural purpose of people whose night had taken an unexpected shape. At Detective Raymond Mercer standing near the east entrance with two officers beside him, his face doing the recalculation she had watched it start in the ballroom doorway 40 minutes ago, now at a stage further along and considerably less comfortable. He saw her looking at him. She did not look away. After a moment, he did. The next 4 hours were the machinery of consequence. Evelyn gave her account to two different officers and then to a detective from a different division whose voice was neutral and whose notebook was thorough, and who asked every question twice to make sure the answers were the same. They were. She had nothing to hide, and she knew the architecture of her own experience well enough to navigate it consistently at any level of detail. Lucien was in a different room with Carla and his own set of officers, and the specific legal topography of a man whose operation had just been both attacked and partially exonerated in the same evening, which was a complicated position to be in, and which Carla managed with the particular genius of a person who understood that complicated positions, properly handled, were often stronger than clean ones. Somewhere in the third hour, Marco arrived and sat down near Evelyn in the hotel corridor where she had been placed with water and a first aid kit, and asked, with the professional economy that was his only register, whether she needed anything. "Desmond," she said. Marco looked at her. "What happened to him?" she said. Not asking permission, just asking. Marco considered this for a moment. "Took the same option as Travis," he said. "Mercer dropped him when the operation changed shape tonight. Man without a handler has no leverage and no protection." He paused. "He made contact with us at 11 p.m., offered everything he knew about Mercer's internal structure in exchange for the same arrangement Travis got." Lucien agreed to that? Lucien agreed to hear the information. "The arrangement is under discussion." Marco's expression was precisely neutral. Desmond spent 6 years inside. What he knows about Mercer's methods and contacts is significant. Evelyn nodded. She thought about what it cost to have someone in your operation for 6 years, to have trusted them in the particular way that Lucien had named, not close exactly, but trusted, which was the category that mattered, and then to have that trust perform its own autopsy in real time. She thought about what a person does with that kind of information about themselves, whether they harden it into a rule or whether they grieve it and move on. She thought about the fact that Lucien had already moved on, that he had been moving through the logistics of this night with full function since the moment the chandelier fell, which was either the most admirable thing she'd ever witnessed or the saddest, and she couldn't yet determine which. She was still sitting with that question at 2 a.m. when the hotel corridor emptied enough that the silence became audible, and Lucien came around the corner from wherever Carla's proceedings had concluded and sat down beside her on the bench where she'd been waiting. They sat in silence for a moment. "It's done," he said. "Mercer." Mercer's case was already weakened by the counter-filing. Tonight, he paused. Tonight made it untenable. Witness intimidation charges. The unmasked attacker who Carla's people have now identified as connected to a man on Mercer's CY list. The chain of custody problems with Desmond's intelligence. He set his hands on his knees. He'll be under internal affairs review by Monday. The warrant applications will be challenged on the basis of compromised sources. His supervisor called Carla at midnight. That fast. When the story changes shape this quickly and this visibly, people in institutional positions move quickly to be on the right side of where it's landing. His voice was dry, not bitter, accurate. Evelyn looked at her arm. The cut had been cleaned and closed properly now, a thin white strip of medical tape. She flexed her hand slowly, feeling the pull of it, the body's honest accounting of what had happened. "The secondary file," she said. "My name. Carla is filing for expungement of the secondary file's references to you as an active motion, on the grounds that it was constructed on fabricated informant intelligence and is now further compromised by the witness intimidation." He looked at her. "She says it closes within 90 days. 90 days. She sat with that number. The shape of it in her hands was different from the shapes she'd been carrying for the last 8 months. Not the shape of something she was saving toward, not the shape of a gap that needed closing. Just time. Just the ordinary passage of time required for machinery to complete its work. And you," she said. "The ports. The ports are more complicated." A pause. "The legitimate operations are protected. The rest..." He stopped. Started again. Some things are going to change. Carla is already working on a restructuring that moves certain operations into wholly legitimate territory. It's not fast, but it's started. She looked at him. Because of tonight. He looked at her. Because of the last 12 days, he said, which was honest and specific, and she received it as both. Outside the hotel's glass entrance, the city was doing its 4 a.m. thing. The particular stillness that Chicago achieved for the 2 or 3 hours between when the night ended and when the morning started. The traffic thinned to single vehicles moving through the grid, with the solitude of people who were either leaving something or arriving somewhere and didn't want to examine which. Rain had started again. She could see it moving through the lobby lights. "Where do I go?" she said. It wasn't quite a question, more of an inventory being taken out loud. "Wherever you want," Lucian said. The simplicity of that, the way he said it without any agenda in it. She thought about the loose tile. She thought about Alaska, where Travis was now constructing some minimal version of a future he hadn't chosen with a name that wasn't his. She thought about the art studio with the good pencils and the sketchbook that had somehow followed her through all of this. She thought about the painting of the diner, the third version, the one that had started to look like something. She thought about this quality of a person who tells you the truth because they've decided you're capable of handling it. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's fine. I'm not—" She stopped, found the sentence again. "I'm not in a position to know where I want to go when I've spent 8 months just trying to get away from somewhere. I know. Which means I need time that isn't about survival, time that's about something else." She looked at her hands. "I've never actually had that." Lucien was quiet for a moment. "There's a property on the coast," he said carefully, Atlantic facing, a main house and a separate studio building. "It's been empty for 2 years. I had intentions for it that didn't materialize." A pause. "It's yours if you want it. No conditions. No arrangement. Just a place that isn't this city, with space to figure out what comes next." She looked at him. She started. "A building," he said. "It's a building. You can throw me out of it any time you decide to." The corner of her mouth moved. Not a full smile. Something smaller and more genuine than a smile. The specific expression that happens when something reaches you past all the defenses before you have time to make a decision about whether to let it through. "You're not subtle," she said. "I've never needed to be." "No," she agreed. "I don't imagine you have." They sat in the quiet lobby. The rain moved against the glass. The city breathed its 4 a.m. breath and turned slowly toward morning. She did not give him an answer that night. She said she needed to sleep, and she meant it, and he did not push it. And she registered that not pushing is more significant than any number of larger gestures would have been, because she had spent enough time with a man who pushed to understand what the absence of it cost someone like Lucian, who was accustomed to outcomes arriving when he required them. He was asking her to arrive on her own schedule. She slept until 11 the next morning in a hotel room on a high floor and woke to the city in daylight, ordinary and enormous and rain-washed to a gray brightness that made everything look recently cleaned. She ordered coffee and sat at the window with it and looked at Chicago from above and thought about the last 12 days with the full, clear attention of someone who has no more immediate emergencies requiring bandwidth. She thought about the diner, about the specific texture of those 2 years, the laminate counter, and the fluorescent tube, and the geography of survival. She had been surviving in that diner the way you survive a winter, head down, enduring, waiting for the temperature to change. She had not been living in it. She was no longer sure she knew the difference between those two things from the inside, which seemed like important information about herself. She thought about the art studio. The first time she'd sat down at that table with the pencil and the paper had been the first time in 3 years that she'd done a thing. Not because it was necessary for survival, but because the doing of it was the point. 3 hours had passed. She had not noticed them passing. She had not spent a single one of those 3 hours calculating or planning or measuring a gap. She had just been inside something. She hadn't understood what she'd lost until she found herself back inside it. 2 weeks later, she was on a coastal road in a rented car with the sketchbook on the passenger seat and the address on her phone, the property resolving from abstract coordinates into an actual place as the highway gave way to a 2-lane road that ran alongside the water. The Atlantic was wide and gray-green on her right, the sky doing its early November low-cloud thing, The light diffused and soft in the way of light that has gone through considerable atmosphere before it gets to you. The property was at the end of a private road. The main house was timber and glass, old enough to have settled into the landscape rather than sitting on top of it. Behind it, separated by a garden that had gone partly wild and partly beautiful in the way that happens when something is tended inconsistently over many years, was the studio building. Separate entrance, good north-facing light. Inside, empty, smelling of old wood and ocean air and the particular clean blankness of a space waiting for someone to start working in it. She stood in the center of it for a long time. Then she called Lucien. He picked up on the second ring. "It's good," she said. "I'm glad." She could hear the city behind him, faint, the ambient noise of Chicago traffic. He was in a car, probably, or at the window of somewhere high. He was always in motion or above things. She was beginning to understand this was not restlessness, but a specific relationship with the world, the need to maintain a vantage point, to see the shape of things before they arrived. She looked at the north-facing light coming through the studio window, at the empty walls, at the wood floor with its years of small marks and imperfections. "Thank you," she said. A pause. "You don't have to thank me." "I know I don't have to." She pressed 2 fingers against the window glass. Cold came through immediately. "I'm doing it anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "How's the coast?" "It's cold. It's loud." She looked out at the gray water visible between the trees. "It's exactly what I needed." "Good." Lucien. Yes. She thought about what she wanted to say. She had been thinking about it for 2 weeks. Not anxiously, not with the old calculus of what it cost and what it got her, but with the slower, more honest attention of someone learning to approach things for the first time from a position of not needing them to be anything in particular. "Come see it when you can," she said. "No agenda, just come see it." A longer pause this time. She waded through it without filling it, which was new for her, which was something she was practicing. "I will," he said, quietly. "Okay?" She let her hand fall from the glass. "I'm going to get my things from the car." "Go." She hung up. She stood in the studio for another minute with the phone in her hand and the light coming through the window at its particular northern angle, and the sound of the ocean outside doing what oceans do. The long, repetitive conversation of water and land that has been ongoing since before there were people to find comfort in it, and which would continue afterward, and which was profoundly uninterested in the outcomes of any specific human story. She found that extremely comforting. She got her things from the car. She put the sketchbook on the wooden work surface in the studio. She opened it to the 3rd version of the diner painting, Chicago, from the street, the neon sign in the foreground, the skyline behind it compressed and slightly distorted by the angle. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned to a blank page. She picked up a pencil. She began. Outside, the Atlantic moved against the coast in its long, indifferent rhythms, and the sky stayed low and gray, and the trees bent slightly in a wind that came off the water cold and straight and honest. The studio held its warmth. The light stayed good. She drew for 3 hours. She did not notice them passing. In Chicago, 5 months later, the Internal Affairs Review concluded with a formal censure against Detective Raymond Mercer and the complete dismissal of the warrant applications his investigation had produced. The compromised informant chain, the misclassification of evidence, the events at the Morrison Grand. Each element had contributed to a case that collapsed inward under the weight of its own structural dishonesty. Mercer resigned before the final findings were published. He was not indicted. The city decided, in its pragmatic way, that a resignation was sufficient, which was an outcome nobody was entirely satisfied with and nobody was surprised by. The DeMarco legal restructuring moved through its first phase. 3 port operations converted to fully legitimate holding companies. Certain other arrangements were allowed to quietly sunset. Carla managed the transition with the same focused intelligence she brought to every high-stakes undertaking, and Lucien managed the human element of it, the internal relationships, the territorial conversations, the diplomacy of telling men who had made their living in a specific way for a long time that the specific way was changing, with the same cold, steady authority that had maintained the empire, now redirected at the task of changing it. It was, by any measure, the harder work. Travis Cole remained in Alaska. No contact. The forged documents held, The fractured jaw healed into something functional, if imperfect, which was probably a fair description of the rest of him. Desmond's information proved useful. Mercer's methodology had relied on a specific approach to informant management that, once documented, was no longer viable. That was the only consequence Desmond received, which was the arrangement, and which was the kind of outcome that didn't satisfy the appetite for justice so much as it satisfied the demands of practicality. The world continued in its practical way. Lucian came to the coast in December. He drove up the private road on a Wednesday morning when the light was the particular winter low of a northeastern coast in the cold months, pale, horizontal, reaching long across everything. She heard the car and looked out from the studio window and watched him get out and stand in the garden for a moment with his coat collar up against the wind and his face turned toward the water. He looked different outside the city. Not smaller. Nothing about him was small, but differently configured, like a word heard in a different language that means something more or less than its translation. She put down her pencil and went outside. They stood in the garden together and looked at the ocean. The wind moved between them and past them and kept going. "It's good," he said. "I told you." He looked at her. She had changed too, and she knew it, though she couldn't have produced a precise accounting of every element. She stood differently. She occupied the space around her differently. Not larger, not louder, just more completely there. More present in the dimensions of herself, less concentrated in the narrow corridor of survival that had been her natural habitat for so long. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the lobby of the Morrison Grand before the doors opened, with the full measure of her, unhurried, uncalculated. "You're painting," he said, "every day. Good work?" She considered this honestly. Some of it is still learning to see what I'm actually looking at instead of what I expect to see." She paused. "That takes longer than I thought." He nodded. That made sense to him, she could tell. They walked down to the water's edge. The beach here was not a soft sand beach. It was rock and coarse gray sand and the detritus of the sea, interesting and indifferent and entirely unconcerned with being pleasant. She liked it for that. They walked along the waterline for a while without talking. The ocean moved beside them in its ongoing way. The wind was cold and consistent and required no response. "Are you staying?" she asked. "Not loaded, just information gathering." "2 days?" he said. "Then back." "Things to manage." "Always." A beat. "It's different now, the managing, the shape of it." He looked out at the water. "I'm not sure I know what to do with a problem that doesn't require a contingency." "You'll figure it out," she said. "You're good at figuring things out." "I had help recently." He looked at her sideways, something almost light in it, which on Lucian was remarkable. She stopped walking. Looked at the ocean for a moment. The horizon was where it always was. That line that looks like an ending from a distance and is actually nothing, just perspective, just the limit of what you can see from where you're standing. She thought about the diner, about the bruise and the concealer and the loose tile, and the slow, patient math of a woman waiting for a number to get big enough to justify the next step. She thought about getting into a car in the rain and not hesitating, about tea at 2 in the morning and the specific quality of a question asked without any cruelty in it, about glass falling in a ballroom and knowing which way to move, about a pencil touching paper for the first time in 3 years and 3 hours disappearing without her consent. She thought about the specific nature of the thing that had happened to her, which was not rescue. She was clear about that, had been clear about it for some time. She had not been saved. She had been placed in proximity to a set of conditions that allowed something in her that had been compressed for a very long time to decompress. The work of that decompression had been entirely her own. The survival had been her own. The art was her own. The decision to stay and the decision to come here and the decision to be standing on this beach were all entirely her own. But proximity mattered. She was willing to say that. She looked at Lucien DeMarco standing in the cold wind on a December beach, with his coat collar up and his eyes on the water, and she thought about the kind of person who moves through the world the way he moved through it. Dangerous and disciplined and carrying a grief he had converted into a code of conduct rather than let convert him into something lesser. And she thought about what it meant that he was here, on this beach, 2 days out of the city and its demands, because she had said, "Come see it." She reached over and put her hand in his. He looked down at it. Then he looked at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He closed his hand around hers, and they stood at the water's edge in the wind and the pale December light and the cold, indifferent company of the Atlantic, and neither of them performed anything, and neither of them made it larger than it was. It was enough. That night she made food in the kitchen of the main house, something simple, the kind of meal that asks nothing of you except attention, and she gave it attention, and he sat at the kitchen counter and watched her cook with the focused stillness he brought to most things, and which she had stopped finding unnerving and started finding, quietly, like company. They ate. They talked. Not about the case or Mercer or the restructuring, not about what had happened in the hotel corridor or the alley behind the diner. They talked about the coast, about the way the light changed through the day and what that meant for working in the studio in different hours, about a book she'd been reading, about Chicago in winter, and what the lake did to the cold. Small talk, in the truest sense. Talk about small things, which is the only honest foundation for anything that intends to be large. After, she washed the dishes and he dried them, which was such an ordinary thing that she almost didn't register it. And then she did register it, and she held the ordinariness of it in her hands carefully for a moment, the way you hold something you've wanted for a long time when it finally arrives looking nothing like you expected and exactly like what you needed. Outside, the ocean kept its conversation with the coast. The wind moved through the trees in the garden. The studio building was dark with its north-facing windows and its blank canvases and its table with the pencils that would be picked up in the morning, and the work would continue, and the light would be what it was, and she would be there inside it. No more running, she had said, a year from now, in a diner where the neon sign still flickered and rain still tapped against the windows. She would say it in the future she was building toward with her own hands, with her own choices, on her own terms. No more hiding, she would answer. And in between those two sentences, in the geography of everything it had taken to get there, the bruises and the math and the alleys and the glass falling in chandeliers and the pencil moving across paper and the cold of the Atlantic and the particular quality of a hand in hers in the winter wind, she had found the only thing she had ever actually needed. Not a hero, not a rescue, not a man powerful enough to make the world safe by being more frightening than everything else in it. Just the understanding that she was someone who survived things, and then chose what came next. That was enough. That had always been enough. She just needed the room to discover it. The ocean said what it always said. The light, in the morning, would be good.